That would be the accusation from the people that don't understand or don't want to believe that my family have been briefing the press.
Without a speech, a warning, or a single headline, King Charles is rumored to have frozen every Sussex-linked asset at once. This was no slow pullback, and there were no second chances. Just a clean, silent financial shutdown. Insiders say this wasn't anger. It was a move planned carefully, carried out quietly, and meant to last. The timing is raising serious questions across royal circles and bringing the royalty to the spotlight once again. So what private moment finally pushed the king to shut everything down? Join us as we explore this tale of royalty. The allowance that stopped. The winter light came early to Clarence House, casting long shadows across polished wooden floors that had known the footsteps of royalty for generations. King Charles sat at his desk in a room that still felt new to him, though he had walked these halls for decades. The leather chair was the same one he had used for years, but everything around it had shifted. He was no longer the prince waiting in the wings. He was the king, and decisions that once belonged to someone else now rested entirely with him. Red boxes lined his desk in neat stacks, each one holding papers that required his attention and his signature. These boxes had accompanied him throughout his life, but their weight felt different now. Each document inside represented choices that affected real people, real families, real futures. Some concerned matters of state and ceremony, others touched something far more personal and complicated. His private secretary entered quietly, the way staff did when they carried news that required careful handling. The man held a folder marked with the kind of discretion that only decades of palace service could teach. Charles looked up from the letter he had been reading and gestured for the secretary to proceed. There was no need for lengthy explanations. Both men understood what this meeting was about. The secretary began speaking in measured tones, laying out figures and dates with the precision that accounting demands. This was the final accounting, he explained, the last review of the funding arrangements that had existed for Prince Harry. The numbers represented what the royal household had provided over time, what had been offered as support beyond what the official records showed. This was the money that came from Charles's personal discretionary funds, money that had flowed privately to help maintain the Sussex household after the younger prince and his wife had chosen to step back from royal duties. However, those arrangements, the secretary made clear, were now formally ending. There would be no more discretionary payments. There would be no more transitional support stretched across months to ease the transition into private life. There would be no more private allowances flowing into accounts that belonged to Harry and Meghan. What remained would be only what Parliament already governed through official channels. Everything else was ceasing, effective immediately. This was not a decision made in haste or in emotion. This was the formal conclusion of something he had already decided years earlier, back in early 2020, when he had spoken privately with his younger son about what financial independence truly meant. The conversation had been difficult then. Charles had made clear that if Harry and Meghan chose to step away from their roles as working members of the royal family, then they could not continue to receive the financial support that came with those roles. You could not reject the institution and still expect the institution to pay for your life. That was the essence of what Charles had told him, and Harry had understood. He understood then, and he would understand now when the formal documentation reflected what had always been understood between them. Charles reached for the document his secretary had placed before him. He picked up his pen, but he did not sign immediately. He paused for a moment, reading through the words one final time, making sure he understood exactly what he was confirming. This was the formal end of financial support that had once cushioned the life of his youngest son and the family he had chosen. This was the moment when the theoretical became real, when the private conversation from years earlier became official record. Then he signed his name. The pen moved across the page in the careful handwriting of a man who had signed thousands of documents over his lifetime. When it was finished, he set the pen down and looked at the signature he had just made. The support that had once been there, however complicated its existence had been, was now officially gone. His son had chosen independence, and now independence was what he would have. Completely and finally. Charles looked up at his secretary and nodded. The meeting was over, the decision was made. The box would go wherever such boxes went, filed away in the palace archives where the quiet business of royal administration lived, far from the eyes of the world but permanent in the records nonetheless. How did the prince take this news? Find out with us. The house that was no longer his. Harry sat in a room with pale walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out toward the ocean. His phone had buzzed with a message from his legal team in London, and he had opened it expecting the usual updates about ongoing matters, the kind of correspondence that came regularly when your life existed across 2 continents and 2 separate legal jurisdictions. Instead, he found a formal notice attached to the message. The words were careful and official, the language of property law and royal estate management. His eyes moved across the screen, reading the same sentences twice to make sure he had understood them correctly. Frogmore Cottage was to be vacated. The lease was being withdrawn. The time frame was not generous. The tone was not negotiable. There was no explanation beyond the phrase estate reallocation. There was no opening for discussion. There was no acknowledgement of the years he had spent there, the money he had invested in renovating it, the life he had tried to build within those walls before everything changed. There was simply the notice itself, delivered through proper channels, the institutional equivalent of a door closing, quietly but firmly. Harry set the phone down on the table beside him. He sat very still, the way people do when they are absorbing information that they knew was possible but had not quite prepared themselves to actually receive. Then he stood up and walked toward the glass doors that opened onto a patio. He did not remember deciding to go outside. His body simply moved in that direction, carrying him away from the interior of the house and into the light. The Pacific Ocean was visible from where he stood, that endless line of blue that separated California from everything he had left behind. He held the phone in his hand still, even though he had finished reading the message. The notice was there, contained in that small rectangle of glass and metal, waiting to become real in the way that official documents eventually always did. Frogmore Cottage had never been a grand house. It was not Windsor Castle or Sandringham House or any of the other royal residences that most people could picture in their minds. It was a modest property on the royal estate in Windsor, the kind of place that existed in the middle distance between public knowledge and private family life. He and Meghan had lived there together, had chosen the colors of the walls and the placement of the furniture. They had invested their own money in making it beautiful, in creating a home that felt like theirs rather than something merely inherited or provided. But it had never truly been his, not really. That was the thing about living on royal land. You inhabited it. You paid rent, or in this case maintained it. You treated it as your own. But ultimately, it belonged to the crown. And the crown, as he was now being reminded, had the power to take it back. What made this different from a simple eviction notice was what the house had represented. Frogmore Cottage was a tether. It was a physical anchor to Britain, to Windsor, to the possibility of return. Even after stepping back from royal duties, even after moving to California and building a new life, the cottage had remained. It had been a place where he could go if he needed to go back. It had been a symbol that he was not entirely severed from the world he had come from, that there was still ground beneath his feet on that side of the ocean. Now that was gone. The lease was being withdrawn, which meant the tether was being cut. There was no negotiation on offer. There was no discussion about what this meant or how long the transition might be. There was simply the administrative reality that the property needed to be vacated, and the process would move forward regardless of his feelings about it. Harry turned from looking at the ocean and looked back at the house behind him, the California house that was real and present, and his in a way that Frogmore had never quite been. This was his life now. This was what remained when you made the choice to step away. This was what it meant to actually achieve independence, to stand on your own rather than within the shadow of an institution that could withdraw things whenever it chose to do so. The phone felt heavy in his hand, though it weighed almost nothing. He knew he would need to respond to his legal team. He knew he would need to make arrangements and begin the process of formally removing himself from yet another piece of his former life. But for this moment, standing on a California patio with the Pacific stretching out before him, he simply stood there and let himself feel the weight of it. The house that had represented possibility was now simply a house that no longer belonged to him. The connection to Britain, already strained and complicated, had just become that much more distant. And returning, if he ever had considered returning, had just become that much less simple. Stay tuned to discover Prince William's take on his brother's loss. The weight of inheritance. Kensington Palace held the kind of quiet that only old buildings full of important work could maintain. The walls had absorbed centuries of decisions, and they seemed to carry that weight silently, without complaint. William sat in a room lined with documents and files, the accumulated paperwork of managing one of England's largest private estates. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting everything in shades of amber and gray. Before him sat the estate managers and financial advisors who handled the day-to-day operations of the Duchy of Cornwall. These were people who understood land values and property management. They had brought briefing papers, spreadsheets, and formal clarifications of arrangements that had been in flux for several years but were now becoming something more permanent and definitive. William listened as they walked through the documents systematically. His questions were practical and direct. He did not ask about feelings or about what anyone wanted or preferred. He asked about mechanics and timelines and the specific legal language that governed how money moved through the duchy's various channels. He wanted to understand exactly which income streams were being closed off, which trust-style distributions would no longer flow, and which duchy privileges were being formally withdrawn. The Sussex line, as it was sometimes called in these rooms, had already been functionally separated from the main duchy operations, but functional separation and formal, permanent closure were not quite the same thing. What these documents represented was the moment when something that had existed in a state of administrative uncertainty was being locked into permanent status. There would be no more discussions about whether arrangements might be resumed. There would be no more ambiguity about whether access might be restored at some future point. The doors were being closed, and they would remain closed. William looked at the figures on the pages before him. The numbers were significant, the kind of money that most people would never see in a lifetime, but they were not the focus of his attention. What mattered was the structure itself, the architecture of how the duchy functioned and who benefited from its income streams. The Duchy of Cornwall existed, fundamentally, to provide funding for the heir to the throne. That was its purpose. That was what it had been created to do. Everything else flowed from that central principle. The estate managers explained that the Sussex arrangement had always been something of an exception, a way of providing support to a junior royal line from the main duchy income. But that exception could not continue indefinitely. Trusts and distributions created complexities in accounting and created obligations that needed clear parameters. If someone was no longer working as a member of the royal family, if someone had chosen to step back from their role within the institution, then maintaining special financial arrangements became difficult to justify. More than that, it became something that worked against the duchy's primary purpose. William asked about the specific timeline. When would these changes become fully effective? Were there any ongoing obligations that needed to be wound down? He asked these questions the way someone might ask about any complex financial matter, with the tone of someone who was trying to understand the machinery rather than judge the people affected by it. One of the managers paused while explaining a particular clause, and William sensed there might be something more beneath the surface of the explanation. But the manager simply continued, and William did not press further. There was no need to. The documents said what they said. The law said what it said. The duchy's purpose said what it said. Everything else was commentary. He set down the papers he had been reading and looked out toward the window for a moment. Somewhere outside these walls, the duchy's vast lands stretched across England, thousands of acres generating income through farming, property rental, and various other ventures. It was an institution older than the modern monarchy itself, and it would continue to function exactly as it had been designed to function, which meant it would fund the heir, and it would support the institution, and it would do these things regardless of individual circumstances or individual wishes. The formality of closing the Sussex line was not something William felt emotionally. He was not angry about it, nor was he troubled by it. It was simply what needed to happen. The duchy was not a charity. It was not designed to support people who had chosen to leave the institution. It was a tool of inheritance, and inheritance had its own logic and its own requirements. In other words, you could not opt out of the royal family and continue to benefit from its financial structures. That would not make sense. That would undermine the entire point of the institution. William turned his attention back to the documents. He asked a few more questions, practical ones about implementation and timing. The managers answered clearly and completely. Everything was in order. Everything had been considered. The legal language was precise. The procedures were clear. Nothing had been overlooked. When the meeting ended, William thanked the managers for their work and for bringing everything to clarity. He would review the final documents once more, but there was nothing here that troubled him or required further discussion. This was simply what inherited structures did. They enforced their own logic. He walked back to his own desk and looked at the stack of other briefing papers waiting for his attention. The duchy line to Sussex was now closed. That chapter was written, and the duchy itself, indifferent to sentiment, continued exactly as it always had, serving its purpose with the kind of patience that only institutions possessed. Keep watching for more on this story of family and tough decisions. The rule that cannot bend. The office was small and windowless. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer holding cases that had moved through the British legal system, some resolved and some still ongoing. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant, neutral hum, casting everything in a brightness that seemed to erase shadows and make the world look flatter and more official than it appeared anywhere else. The legal advisor sat at a desk that held only the current case file and a computer screen. The file was not particularly thick, but its contents had been examined countless times already, picked over and analyzed from every possible angle. It concerned security arrangements for Prince Harry, or more specifically, the absence of certain security arrangements that Harry had requested from the government. The advisor was not new to work like this. Years in the civil service meant understanding how policy worked, how law worked, and most importantly, how the intersection of policy and law determined what could happen and what could not. This case was unusual only in that it involved someone famous, someone whose life existed partly in the public eye, but the legal principles applied to anyone who requested state protection. The court ruling lay open on the desk. The language was precise, written the way legal language always was written, with every word chosen to mean exactly what it said and nothing more. The ruling was clear on the central point. Protection provided by the state was role-based, not birth-based. A person's protection status was tied to the function they performed within institutions that required protection. If a person no longer held that role, if a person had chosen to step away from the institution, then the protection that came with that role ended. Prince Harry had stepped back from his role as a working member of the royal family. He had ceased to perform the public functions that had made him eligible for the kind of armed protection that the state provided to royals. Therefore, he was no longer automatically entitled to that protection. It was as straightforward as that. The advisor understood, in the way that people who worked in government came to understand such things, that this would feel personal to Harry. He was not accustomed to being denied access to things. He had been born into a position where certain privileges simply existed, available to him as a matter of circumstance rather than as something he needed to earn or justify. Being told that those privileges no longer applied, being told that the state would not provide what his family background had once assured him of, would feel like a rejection. It would feel like punishment. It would feel personal. But policy did not exist in the realm of personal feelings. Policy existed in the realm of rules and consistency, and the kind of fairness that came from applying the same standards to everyone. If the rule was that armed protection depended on role, then the rule applied to everyone. It applied to Prince Harry just as it applied to anyone else. The advisor had seen cases like this before, cases where the human element wanted to push against the structural element. That was not how government worked. Government was about structures that persisted regardless of individual circumstances. Government was about rules that applied consistently because that was what gave rules their meaning. The court ruling had considered all of Harry's arguments. It had examined his claims that his particular situation warranted special consideration. It had reviewed his security concerns and his specific circumstances. And after that examination, the court had concluded that the law was clear. Protection was role-based. Harry no longer held the role. Therefore, the protection did not apply. There had been offers, the advisor knew. There had been discussions about what alternatives might exist, what security arrangements might be purchased privately, what compromises might be reached. But what could not be offered was what Harry had apparently wanted, which was for the state to provide armed protection as if he still held his former role. That could not happen because the law said it could not happen. The advisor closed the file and made a note in the system that the case had been reviewed and confirmed. There was nothing new to say here. The ruling stood. It would continue to stand unless the courts decided to revisit it, which seemed unlikely. Harry could appeal again if he chose to, could ask the courts to reconsider, could continue to push against the boundary. But the boundary itself would not move. The rule about role-based protection was not going to change because one person found it inconvenient or painful. This was what working in government meant. It meant accepting that policy had its own logic, separate from sympathy or sentiment. It meant understanding that rules once established created a kind of inertia that could not easily be overcome. It meant knowing that somewhere, someone was going to be unhappy with every decision, but that unhappiness did not change what the law required. The advisor looked at the wall clock. It was late enough in the afternoon that the office had grown quieter. Most of the other civil servants had already left. But there was always more work, always another file waiting to be reviewed, another ruling to be examined, another intersection of policy and human circumstance to be carefully documented and filed away. The case was closed. Not in the sense that nothing more would happen, but in the sense that the legal question had been answered. Protection was role-based. Harry no longer held the role. The ruling stood, and in a world that cared very much about feelings and personal narratives, that simple legal fact would continue to complicate someone's life in ways that the law itself did not and would not account for. Is this the end for Prince Harry? If you stay with us, you're sure to find out. Silent understanding. Camilla found Charles in his study, the room illuminated only by the desk lamp and the glow from the fire that burned in the fireplace behind him. Papers lay scattered across the surface in front of him, the accumulated correspondence of a man who received far more letters than he could possibly respond to in any reasonable time frame. She did not announce herself. After decades together, she had learned when to speak and when to simply exist in the same space as someone. She moved to the small table where the tea things were kept, the silver pot and the cups that had been used in this room for years. She poured the tea without asking if he wanted it, because she knew he did, and she brought it to his desk and set it down beside the papers he was reading. Charles looked up briefly, acknowledged her presence with a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and then returned his attention to the letter in his hands. Camilla could not see which letter it was. There were too many of them, scattered across the desk in no particular order, but she recognized the quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved across the words with the kind of focus that suggested he was reading something that required careful consideration. She settled into the chair across from the desk, the one that had been placed there for exactly this purpose, for sitting across from him while he worked. She did not pick up her own tea immediately. Instead, she watched him read, understanding without being told that this was one of those nights when the weight of everything pressed a little harder than usual. Charles set down the letter and picked up another one, then another. The pile of unread correspondence seemed to grow rather than diminish as the evening went on. Camilla understood what was happening. These were not letters that required answers that could be given easily or quickly. These were letters that demanded something from him, that asked for responses he could not provide, that posed questions that had no simple solutions. She knew who some of them were from, or at least she could guess. The palace operated on patterns, and patterns were easy to read if you had been paying attention for as long as she had. There would be letters from Harry, or about Harry. There would be correspondence on recent matters, the terminated financial agreement, and letters from people hoping a phone call would change the situation for good. Charles answered none of them. Camilla understood why. She had spent enough years in proximity to power to know that the monarchy survived through a particular kind of discipline. It survived by not reacting in the way that ordinary people reacted. It survived by allowing systems to work as they had been designed to work, rather than by having individuals step in and bend those systems around their personal relationships or their personal feelings. If Charles called Harry, if he issued some kind of statement softening the positions that had been taken, if he intervened in the decisions that had been made by courts and government officials and estate managers, then the entire structure would begin to shift. Every decision would become something that could be negotiated. The institution would begin to unravel at its edges, not dramatically, but slowly and surely, the way that institutions unraveled when their boundaries became unclear. So Charles did not call. He did not issue statements. He did not intervene. He allowed the systems to work as they had been designed to work, and he read the letters that asked him to do otherwise, and he did not answer them. Camilla had learned this kind of restraint long ago. She understood that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was to remain silent, to not react, to allow events to unfold according to their own logic, rather than trying to redirect them according to personal preference. She had watched Charles learn this lesson over decades, watched him understand that being the heir or being the king meant accepting constraints that ordinary people never had to accept. She picked up her tea and drank it slowly. It was still warm. She had timed it correctly, as she always did. Across from her, Charles continued reading through his correspondence, setting aside letters one by one, not answering them, not indicating that he would answer them, simply acknowledging their existence and then moving on to the next one. After a while, he looked up again and met her eyes. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that needed saying. Camilla understood what he was doing and why he was doing it. She understood that this silence was not coldness or indifference. It was discipline, the consistent application of standards that did not change based on who was affected by them. Charles reached for his tea and drank it, and Camilla rose quietly to pour him another cup. She moved back to her chair and settled into it again, and they sat together in the study as the fire burned and the papers accumulated and the letters that would not be answered remained unread in the growing pile on his desk. This was what being the king meant. It meant not calling. It meant not explaining. It meant allowing the machinery of government and law and policy to function without interference, even when that machinery affected people you had created, people you had loved, people who were connected to you by blood and history, and all the complicated weight of family. So, Charles sat in his study late into the night, reading letters he would not answer, and Camilla sat across from him in silent understanding, pouring tea when it grew cold, asking nothing, offering nothing but her presence and the kind of companionship that only came from understanding exactly what someone was enduring and why they were enduring it. Don't go yet. There's more to come. The mathematics of separation. At the office at St. James's Palace, everything had its place, and that place was known. Anne sat at a desk, surrounded by files that contained the operational structure of her role, the patronages and military affiliations and ceremonial responsibilities that made up what it meant to be a working member of the royal family. These were concrete responsibilities, each one representing organizations that looked to her for support and direction. Her private secretary had brought the latest ceremonial protocols for review. There were always new protocols to consider, always new situations that required careful thought about precedent and propriety. But this particular stack of documents concerned something slightly different. These were reviews related to roles and responsibilities, and what had happened to the various positions that the Sussexes had once held. Anne looked through the documents systematically. She did not need to ask her secretary which ones concerned Harry and Meghan. She could see it in the organization of the papers themselves, in the way that certain files had been grouped together and marked with particular attention. These were the files that tracked what had been held and what had been released. The list was longer than people sometimes realized. Military patronages that had been held and then relinquished. Charitable organizations that had looked to the Sussexes for support and then had to find other patrons. Ceremonial roles that had been active and then had ceased to be active. Operational responsibilities that had existed and then had ended. It was a comprehensive list. Anne ran through the items with her aide, not because she needed reminding of what had happened, but because documentation was part of the process. Everything needed to be recorded. Everything needed to be clear and precise and available for reference. This was how the institution maintained its institutional memory, through careful documentation of what had been and what was. Her aide explained the current status of each item. The patronages had been reassigned or were in the process of being reassigned. The military affiliations had been transferred to other members of the family who could actually fulfill those responsibilities. The ceremonial roles had been formally closed. Nothing remained in a state of ambiguity. Nothing was being held in reserve for some future restoration. Everything that had been held had either been formally released or formally transferred. Anne made a few notes as the aide spoke, mostly to confirm that everything was in order, that the documentation was correct, that nothing had been overlooked. These were not notes of instruction. They were notes of confirmation, of ensuring that the record was accurate and complete. Anne picked up the protocol documents again and reviewed them more carefully. The mathematics of it was actually quite simple once you stopped trying to layer emotion onto the administrative facts. You could not simultaneously step away from an institution and continue to benefit from the institutional positions. That was not how institutions worked. Institutions required participation. They required commitment. They required people who showed up and fulfilled responsibilities rather than people who expected the benefits while declining the work. The Sussexes had made a choice. They had chosen to step back from their roles as working members of the royal family. That choice had consequences, not as punishment but as simple administrative reality. If you were not going to be a working member of the royal family, then you could not hold positions that were designed for working members of the royal family. It was not complicated. It was not cruel. It was simply how the system functioned. Anne made a final note confirming that everything was in order, that all the patronages and roles had been properly transferred or closed, that nothing remained in a state of incomplete separation. The work was done. The transition was complete. There was nothing left to review or decide or debate. The Sussexes held no active roles. They held no military patronages. They held no operational responsibilities. Nothing dramatic had occurred because nothing needed to occur. The situation had simply resolved itself through the application of standard institutional protocol. Her aide gathered the papers and left. Anne remained at her desk for a moment, thinking about the nature of institutions and how they perpetuated themselves through the simple, relentless application of rules that did not bend for individual circumstances. The monarchy had survived for centuries not because it was particularly sentimental about its members, but because it understood that sentiment could not be allowed to interfere with the functioning of the institution itself. The monarchy sure rules with an iron fist. Let's keep viewing to find out what happens next. When everything changes. Years had passed since the decision. Harry sat in a room in California that looked out onto nothing in particular, just the ordinary landscape of a life that had been built separately from the one he was born into. The years had a way of changing how you understood things, of allowing you to see patterns that were not visible when you were living through them moment by moment. He had waited, in the beginning, for the dramatic confrontation that never came. He had anticipated some kind of final conversation, some moment where everything would be laid out and explained and resolved through words exchanged between people who shared blood and history. But the monarchy did not work that way. The monarchy, as he had come to understand, did not deal in drama when it could deal in administration instead. There had been no single press release announcing the end of anything. There had been no public statement from the palace explaining what was happening or why. There had been no frozen bank accounts, no dramatic gesture that could be pointed to as the moment when everything changed. The allowance had ended, not with a confrontation but with accounting. The house had been taken back, not with a dramatic eviction but with a formal notice. The security had been withdrawn, not through a personal decision but through a court ruling that applied legal standards he could not argue with. The patronages had been reassigned, the military titles had been transferred, the roles had been given to others. Nothing had been done to him. Everything had simply been withdrawn from him. What he understood now, years later, was that the monarchy had not exiled him. Exile implied an act, implied someone making a decision to cast someone out. What had actually happened was more subtle and more complete. The monarchy had simply stopped holding space for him. It had stopped creating exceptions. It had stopped maintaining the fiction that he was both inside and outside simultaneously. It had allowed him to go in the way that institutions allowed things to go, not through drama but through the steady, relentless withdrawal of access and support and the various privileges that came with belonging. There was a kind of finality in that which was more absolute than any dramatic rupture could have been. A rupture could potentially be healed. A rupture was something that happened between people, and people could change their minds. However, this was not a rupture. This was simply the institution functioning according to its own logic, according to rules that had existed long before he was born and would continue to exist long after he was gone. He had chosen to step away from it, and it had simply allowed him to do so, and in allowing him to do so, it had taken back everything that came with being inside. He thought about his father, the king, sitting late at night reading letters he would not answer. He thought about William, reviewing the documents that clarified how the duchy worked. He thought about Anne, making notes about patronages and roles with the same clinical detachment that one might use to review any other administrative matter. He thought about Camilla, understanding without words. None of them had been cruel to him, not really. Cruelty implied intent, implied someone making a choice to hurt him. What they had done was something more fundamental. They had simply allowed the institution to function as it had been designed to function, and in doing that, they had protected the institution in a way that superseded their personal feelings about him or about the situation. Now, here he was, years later, understanding that there had never been a moment when he could have done anything differently that would have changed the outcome. The logic of it had been set in motion from the beginning, from the moment he had decided that he could not continue to be what the institution required him to be. Once that decision was made, everything else had followed naturally, like water finding its way downhill, like institutions doing what institutions did. The forms were still in his files somewhere, the notices and rulings and letters from solicitors. They did not look like the end of anything when you read them individually. Each one was routine, bureaucratic, the kind of document that anyone dealing with property or finances or legal matters might receive. But they had added up to something much larger. They had added up to the systematic, methodical, complete removal of everything that had connected him to the world he was born into. The silence that had replaced everything was the most complete form of ending he could have imagined. It was the absence of explanation, the absence of justification, the absence of dialogue. It was simply the institution moving forward without him, continuing to function according to its own rules, allowing him to go while simultaneously taking back, methodically and thoroughly, every piece of infrastructure that had made his life as a member of that institution possible. Harry looked out the window at the California landscape, the life he had built in the years since everything had been withdrawn. It was real. It was his. It did not depend on leases or allowances or patronages or the goodwill of an institution that moved according to rules he could not change and could not appeal. In that sense, he had gotten what he had said he wanted. He had achieved independence, not through a dramatic gesture or a final conversation, but through the slow, patient withdrawal of everything that had made dependence possible. But the cost of that independence had been higher than he might have anticipated, measured not in money but in connection, in belonging, in the ability to return to the world he was born into. That door, it turned out, had not been slammed. It had simply been allowed to close, quietly and completely, until going back was not a matter of someone saying no. It was simply a matter of the door no longer existing, replaced by the kind of distance that forms could create and time could deepen and silence could make absolute. That's that for this video. Now, tell us what you think. Is there hope for Prince Harry? Will this final decision be reversed sometime eventually? Share your thoughts below, and if this tale stirred something in you, share with us in the comment. Let the story of life and love encourage us to live our best moments with the people we love.